Good morning. My name is Jeff Schock. I'm one of the pastors here at Crossroads, and I'm excited to share in today's teaching. This is the final installment in our series that we've been going through over these last 8 weeks, the Gospel according to Moses. But before we get into today's text, I have some family business that we need to discuss. First, I want to dovetail onto what Hee-Chan talked about. Next week is our Fall Fest. This is a great opportunity for you to invite friends and family. It's going to be a good time. We've got a bunch of baptisms, and we're going to have a taco truck, but also you might have heard that there's a push-up contest. This is something of a tradition here at Crossroads. When we can't pay for stuff, we have a push-up contest. And so we have a youth ministry that has been growing and growing over these last several semesters, and they need a budget. We got to keep the kids in pizza, y'all. So what you can do to help out is you can do some push-ups. Brandon will be in the courtyard afterwards. He has a sponsorship form, so you can sign up and you can ask people to sponsor you per push-up or a lump sum or whatever. But if you're not feeling so spry, you can just sponsor somebody doing push-ups. You can sponsor me. Also, I'll let you know that half of the worship team are wrestlers and jiu-jitsu fighters, and so I threw the gauntlet down. I said, they're all half my age or less. And I said, let's see if you can beat the old man. So you can sponsor me, you can sponsor Michael, Trajan, Lucas, any of them. But you can find out more. Just go over by the donuts. Brandon will be out there after service. Okay, could use your help. All right. That said, many of you will know Usha Gaikwad. She was one of the very first people I met during my tenure here at Crossroads. And she, this week, went home to be with the Lord. She ended her final fight with pain. She had been suffering with cancer for some time. And she was a beautiful, beautiful soul. And even to the very end, I got to be with her in the hospital. And she took communion. And she went home to be with the Lord. So we wanted to let you know. And there'll be more information about a remembrance forthcoming. And it's not all bad news. We actually were also blessed last week to welcome a brand new baby into the family. I want to introduce Saraya Jasmine Bradley to you. That is Damien's new baby girl. Baby and mom are doing great. I got to meet them in the hospital. She was in that little blue incubator for a little while, but she's looking much better now. And so we just invite you to lift them up in prayer as they are now parents of 2 kids. You got to go to, it's a man-to-man scheme. You got 3, it's a zone. All right, just so you know. All right, with that said, let's take a look. We are finishing up our series on the Gospel according to Moses. We're going to be in Exodus chapter 40. I'm going to read for us verses 20 through 36, the passage on which this teaching is based, and then we will dive into it. All right, Exodus 40. The words will be on the screen. I want to invite you to turn along, to follow along. Exodus chapter 40, verse 20. He took the tablets of the covenant law and placed them in the ark, attached the poles to the ark, put the atonement cover over it. Then he brought the ark into the tabernacle and hung the shielding curtain and shielded the ark of the covenant law as the Lord commanded him. Moses placed the table in the tent of meeting on the north side of the tabernacle outside the curtain and set out the bread on it before the Lord as the Lord commanded him. He placed the lampstand in the tent of meeting opposite the table on the south side of the tabernacle and set up lamps before the Lord as the Lord commanded him. Moses placed the gold altar in the tent of meeting in front of the curtain and burned fragrant incense on it as the Lord commanded him. Then he put up the curtain at the entrance to the tabernacle. He set the altar of burnt offering near the entrance to the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, and offered on it burnt offerings and grain offerings as the Lord commanded him. He placed the basin between the tent of meeting and the altar and put water in it for washing. And Moses and Aaron and his sons used it to wash their hands and feet. They washed whenever they entered the tent of meeting or approached the altar as the Lord commanded Moses. Then Moses set up the courtyard around the tabernacle and altar and put up the curtain at the entrance to the courtyard, and so Moses finished the work. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it. And the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. In all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud did not lift, they did not set out until the day it lifted. This is the word of the Lord. If you've been here over these last few weeks, we've been looking at Exodus, which is one of the really cool, fun high points of ancient biblical narrative. It's got the story of God's deliverance of his people of Israel out of slavery. And if you've been here, you know that the story is awesome, and it's been depicted in cinema and in art because it is so awesome. You've got the plagues, you've got the Nile turning to blood, you've got the death of the firstborn, you have Pharaoh pursuing Israel through the desert, and then you have the parting of the Red Sea. You have all this fantastic stuff. And then when you get a little further on, after the law is given on Sinai, you get a little further on in the book, and it starts to, if you're reading it, and I want to encourage you to read it, it doesn't take you that long, you might think, wow, the second half is a little boring. It gets a little dry. There's all this deeply nuanced instruction about how Israel is to worship God. And what we just read in chapter 40 were instructions on how the tabernacle is to be constructed. Now, I have to tell you, this is the apex. This is the crescendo. This is the high point. You'd be tempted to think that it was the death of the firstborn and God, the sacrifice of the lambs and the God's wrath passing over the people, or perhaps the parting of the Red Sea. No, it was all headed here. And if you've been out, you recall, and gosh, if you've seen any of the movies, you know God says, set my people free. But he's not setting them free for freedom's sake. It's set my people free so that they can worship me. So the story of Israel's deliverance is a story of slavery to freedom. And freedom, in the language of the scriptures, is the worship of God. And that is what brings us to the tabernacle. This is the high point. This is where it was all headed. This is the apex and the crescendo of the entire story. And so the word tabernacle, we've got to ask a couple of questions of it. And here's the outline, by the way, for you note takers. We're asking, what is it? Why do we need it? Where can we find it? And what does it mean? All right, first, what is it? The word tabernacle is a word that we translate from the Hebrew. There's kind of two words that get translated that way. It's a tent or to dwell. All right. And the tabernacle we see being constructed right here is also referred to as the tent of meeting. This was the predecessor to the temple. And so they were led through the desert, through the Negev by God's presence, and he brings them. And then it says, this was one of the promises from earlier in Exodus, that he will be with them. They will be his people and he will be their God. He tabernacled with them. He dwelled with them. And this is fundamentally what the tabernacle is. It is a way for God's people to connect to him. Now, what's interesting about this is every single culture across the centuries around the world has had some version of this. You know that you can go to any one of hundreds of ancient religions, and they had altars and they had shrines, or they had holy men that somehow bridged the gap between people and God. There's a kind of inborn intrinsic sense all people have that there is a transcendent reality in the universe and we don't have access to it. And so there's something inborn in all people and in all cultures in it, and they manifest it in an effort to somehow bridge that gap. And every single culture on earth that has ever lived has had some version of it, except this one, except ours. We, and this, you can go back in our kind of modern Western history. You go back a little bit, you get to the period of the Enlightenment, and then a little bit after that, and these kind of all contribute to that, but a little after that, you get the existentialists. When I was in high school, as I believe I was my junior year, somebody made me read The Stranger by Albert Camus. And that is something of an existentialist manifesto, but you can read Friedrich Nietzsche and the rest of the German philosophers, which, if you want to get really sad, read some German philosophers. And the existentialism, I'll give you the 30,000-foot view, is the philosophical precept that you are basically just the collocation of molecules. You're a sack of chemicals. You're here by complete accident, and there really is no meaning to life. That's it. You are alone in a cold and uncaring universe. And no wonder that idea hasn't really gotten any traction, because it didn't take. It doesn't really square with our view of reality. And the fact of the matter is that many people are waking up to the insufficiency of such an explanation. Now, when I was a young man growing up in New York, my parents were kind of like overeducated Northeast liberals, the party line, the Kool-Aid that I was being asked to drink was that all the really smart people, all the ivory towers, all the intellectuals, those are the atheists. Right? If you're really smart, you don't believe in God. Religion is really just a crutch for weak-minded people and kind of silly, uneducated people from the South. That was the caricature. But it doesn't really stand. And so modern people are kind of waking up to the insufficiency of some of those worldviews. And I remember when I was growing up, my dad, bless his soul, you can pray for him. He's fighting cancer now. This happens. But he was the religious influence in my life, and I grew up in the Catholic tradition. So he would wake me up every Sunday morning to go to 8 o'clock Mass at Our Lady Hope, and I'd sit there and I'd stare at the stained glass windows, and I'd search for the transcendent, I guess. And I remember, because I was a fairly analytical young man, and I remember thinking, are there any good reasons to believe this? I mean, the story of the Bible, what I've been hearing in church and in religion class, it certainly seems a little far-fetched. What about all these miracles? Is there a rationale? Is there a compelling rationale that would allow a thoughtful, educated person to believe any of this stuff? And my dad, who was a PhD, he said, no, there's no rationale. It's faith. That's why you call it faith. You just have to believe. Maybe some of you had the same explanation. And one of the reasons why these old caricatures and pastiches of the way religion was maybe positioned in our culture and in our framework, the reason that they're falling flat, the reason that they didn't take, and the reason why many scholars are kind of waking up to it is there really are compelling rationales that would allow you late modern individualist Western people to believe that there is a greater transcendent reality. And I can't go into it at length, but I want to give them to you because you might have that conversation with your kid one day. And I don't expect you to understand these at length, but I expect you to write them down and I expect you to Google them later, okay? So the first is the cosmological argument. I alluded to this last week all too briefly, but the cosmological argument is kind of the argument that many astrophysicists make all the way from, Paul Davies, Francis Collins, even Stephen Hawking. They saw the fingerprint of a higher power in the physical universe. And don't take my word for it. I'm a pastor. I don't know the first thing about astrophysics. But Paul Davies is a professor of physics at Arizona State University, and this is what he said. He said, scientists are slowly waking up to an inconvenient truth. The universe looks suspiciously like a fix. The issue concerns the very laws of nature themselves. For 40 years, physicists and cosmologists have been quietly collecting examples of all too convenient coincidences and special features in the underlying laws of the universe that seem to be necessary in order for life and hence conscious beings to exist. Change any one of them and the consequences would be lethal. Sometimes this is called the argument from fine-tuning. And I'll give you the 30,000 foot. The thesis is this, that there are literally thousands, it's as if there are thousands of dials that have been adjusted just precisely. And if one of them were off by just the slightest integer, life wouldn't exist. This is the argument from fine-tuning. Go, Google it, okay? Paul Davies, Dr. Francis Collins was the head of the National Institute for Health. Maybe his name sounds familiar to you. He's in the news a lot in recent times. And he is a geneticist by trade, and he came to similar conclusions, whereas the astrophysicists and the cosmologists, they look at the universe and they see it. He looks at the genetic code and he sees something very similar. This is what he writes. When you look from the perspective of a scientist at the universe, it looks as if it knew we were coming. There are 15 constants, that gravitational constant, various constants about the strong and weak nuclear force, etc., that have precise values. If any one of these constants was off by even 1 part in a million, or in some cases by 1 part in a million, the universe could not have actually come to the point where we see it. Matter would not have been able to coalesce. There would have been no galaxy, stars, planets, or people. That's a phenomenally surprising observation. It seems almost impossible that we're here. And that does make you wonder, gosh, who was setting those constants anyway? Scientists have not been able to figure that out. When I grew up, it was a caricature. There was a caricature that smart, educated people couldn't believe in God because the natural evidence just didn't support it. But that, as it happened, turned out to be a very short-sighted view and one that is rapidly falling out of fashion. So I want to challenge you. If you're here today and maybe that is the baggage that you brought through the door thinking, oh, I'm a thinking person. I can't possibly believe this. Look at all these people. I thought you went to college. How could you subscribe to such an odd belief system? There are actually very compelling rationales. I had to come to a place where my head would let my heart go. And I promise you, if you go digging, they're there. There's another argument I want to at least acquaint you with. This is the moral argument. Philosophers like Immanuel Kant, C.S. Lewis, probably most famously, are the ones that champion this argument. And it goes something like this. Without the existence of a kind of divine creator, you are actually not an autonomous being. You are just at the mercy of your hormones, your genetics, and your brain chemistry. All of your conclusions, all of your feelings, they're just the facets of your biology. There's nothing really profound about them. C.S. Lewis, he writes in Mere Christianity, he says, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exist. A baby feels hunger, well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim, well, there is such a thing as water. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. This is the thesis of Exodus. You have been created for a relationship. You have been created for a specific purpose, to worship God. And there is an innate, intrinsic longing in all of us for that. And so have you held your baby in your hands? That's real. That is not just the product of your biology. That is not just dopamine and oxytocin flooding your hippocampus. That is transcendent. And when you see evil and suffering, there's something deep in your bones that rails against it. That is not just an overdeveloped herd instinct and the product of evolution. And it doesn't square with your view of reality, does it? Right? And so if your premise leads you to a conclusion that you know isn't right? If you're looking at the world and you've experienced love and you've experienced anger and oppression, and somebody told you along the way that is just simply brain chemistry, and you know that conclusion is wrong, you have to go back and re-examine the premise. And the entire premise of Exodus is that you were created by God and you were created for a specific purpose. The shorter Westminster Catechism, you Reformed people will love me. It's the chief end of man is to know him and to glorify him forever. That is why you were created. And that is why God frees Israel from slavery. He takes them out of bondage and he leads them into the promised land. Why? So he could tabernacle with them. So he could dwell with them so that they would have his presence and he could be in their presence. That is the whole point of the tabernacle. It's a way to connect with God, and every one of us is looking for it, whether you admit it or not. Next, why do we need it? Why do we need it? You'll notice if you read this, and really it starts in Exodus 35, there is this really robust set of instructions about how this tabernacle is supposed to be constructed. And we find out right here that what Moses does is he takes the Ark of the Covenant, the one from the Indiana Jones movies. He takes that and he puts it in the middle. And then he builds everything around it, kind of coming out in concentric circles. And there are altars and there are lamps and there are basins. And we find out in verses 34 and 35 where it says, then the cloud covered the tent of meeting and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. In verse 35, it says, Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it. So the glory of God hovers over the ark. And this is, by the way, the word glory in Hebrew is the word kavod, and it means the weight. And what else is important about this verse is in 35 where it says it settled on it. That's the Hebrew word sakan. And this is where we get the term Shekinah glory. You might have heard that thrown around. This is the glory cloud, the settled glory of God, the presence of God. And it's worth noting that Moses could not go in. My favorite metaphor, my favorite explanation of this, and I've used it many times, is Indiana Jones, the first one, where they got him tied up at the end, and the Nazis decide they're going to open the Ark of the Covenant, and all their faces melt off. That's why he couldn't go in, because this is the holy presence of God. You can't just go into it, but it's precisely what we need. Look, in Psalm 16, verse 11, it says this: "You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore." This is the very thing you've been made for, the thing you've been looking for your entire life. And if you're anything like me, I've had a couple of moments in my life. I remember the time when I was in a church. I walked in a skeptic, and I prayed the first prayer of my adult life. I was having something of an existential crisis in my mid-20s, which I won't go into, but I was searching for God, and I prayed a very simple prayer at the end of that service. I said, "Jesus, are you there?" And in a moment, I knew that he was. And in a moment, I knew that he was there through all the pain and all the hardship. And it overwhelmed me with such a sense of like awe and wonder and love. I encountered Christ. I thought I was the last person on earth that would ever encounter Christ. My mother is the second person who thought that. But that moment changed my life. And I have to tell you, for 6 months, the sky was bluer. Food tasted better. Everything, there was just like a kind of a quality that began to shape my existence, and there was just like just warmth and beauty to high heaven. And then I became acutely aware of something else. And I've been a pastor now for 20 some odd years, and I've gotten to observe this in a number of people. When I had a professor one time that said, and he was joking, but he said, when people get saved, when they first encounter Jesus, you kind of have to lock them up for a year because they're so excited about it. They'll be clumsy in their witness. They're a little too over the top, right? But then I began to realize something. I had realized the grace of God in a moment. I asked God, I said, "Are you there?" And he met me. And I experienced a kind of love and a kind of longing. It was overwhelming. But then I began to realize something else about God, his holiness. And frankly, it's a little terrifying. I remember the very first time where in hindsight, I always use movies for metaphors, and this one's a real rando. So if anybody has ever seen the original 1981 Time Bandits, anybody? All right, now you gotta go watch that after The Princess Bride, Time Bandits. The whole story is very theological in its tone. There's a war going on between God and the devil. It's the supreme being and evil personified. And that was the first time, I think I was 6, 7 years old when I saw this movie, where God wasn't just this warm, numinous, happy dude with a beard. He was played by Sean Connery, but he was terrifying. That is the same thing that I began to realize as I began to pursue God, to be able to learn about him, to understand his word, that God is loving, God is gracious, but he is also holy. And frankly, it's a little frightening. And this is the very reason why Moses cannot go in. And this is the reason, by the way, why people never, if they're honest with themselves, will not have a tepid reaction to Jesus. There are only 2 logical ways to respond to Christ and his claims. Either you bow your knee and worship him. He said that before Abraham was, I am. He took on the name of the deity. He claimed to be God incarnate. So Lewis put it great. He's one of 3 options. He is either a lunatic, on par with somebody claiming to be a poached egg, or he is a liar, on a par with the devil from hell, or he is who he claimed to be. So you cannot have a tepid reaction to this person. You cannot just say, like a lot of modern people say, "Oh, well, that's good for you. I'm glad you have that." You have one of 2 rational choices. One, you have to curse him. The other one is you have to crown him. And this is the reason, and the Bible explains it. This is why people have such a vehement opposition to the existence of God, to the worship of God, to the person and the work of Jesus Christ. Right? This is why it elicits such passion on one hand and such rage on the other. And the Bible speaks to this. It says, because we sinned against him. Everything you need to learn about life, or most of it, is in the first 3 chapters of Genesis. And we find out there that God created men and women in his image, equal image bearers of God, and that we sinned against him. And as a result of that sin, our relationship was broken. Now we cannot be in his presence because he is holy and we are not. And we find out, if you read Genesis 1, 2, and 3, you find out that God places a cherubim, which is just an awe-inspiring, very frightening angel, and a flaming sword to keep us from the presence of God. I think it's very interesting that these symbols, the cherubim and the flaming sword, the symbols of this broken relationship, if you read carefully in the Old Testament, in Exodus chapters 35 to 40, also in 1 Kings, there's a couple of places where it describes the veil that was separating the presence of God from his people. You know what it's adorned with? Cherubim. This is God saying, I am going to replicate the garden where my presence will be with you. Do you remember, if you're familiar with the story? He came down, he walked with them in the cool of the day. They had unadulterated, unimpeded access to the presence of God. And then because sin entered the world, that was destroyed. But in the tabernacle, God says, I am making a beachhead here in this broken world so that you will have access to my presence. Conditional access. But that's why we need it. It is a replica of the garden. It is God saying, I have landed, I am here, I am with you. You can't come into my presence in the way that you would like, but I am still with you. Now, where do we find it? The tabernacle that's created here, this is also known as the tent of meeting. It would have been a very rustic looking affair, but eventually there would be a temple built. This was the predecessor to that temple. That temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. And then the temple would be reconstructed, but then again destroyed by Titus in 70. And it has not, which I think is a little eerie, has not been reconstructed to this day. So where do we find it? Where do we find the tabernacle? In John's gospel, John uses some very interesting language. This is what he says in John 1:14. He says, the word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. If you have an older translation, perhaps the King James, and the literal word is, the word became flesh and he tabernacled among us. Jesus, as it happens, is that tabernacle. In John 2, Jesus says, he's speaking to the Pharisees, and he says, Jesus answered them, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. They replied, it has taken 46 years to build this temple and you're going to raise it in 3 days? But the temple he had spoken of was his body. Jesus is a new and better tabernacle where there is not a physical location that you're going to somehow make a pilgrimage to in order to experience the presence of God. Christians, because of Jesus' matchless life and his sacrifice on the cross, the cleansing work of his salvific sacrifice, now we can come into the presence of God. We can have the presence of God in our lives because of Christ. Hebrews 10, the writer of Hebrews caught on to this. He says, therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way, opened for us through the curtain that is his body. There was a curtain that separated the Holy of Holies, where the glory of God resided, from everybody else, so that I assumed their faces wouldn't melt off like the Nazis in Indiana Jones. And because of Jesus, the writer in Hebrews tells us, because of Jesus, that veil has been opened to us because of his blood and his sacrifice. Now you have access to the presence of God. Now you can worship God in spirit and in truth because of Christ, the very thing that you've been created for. This is what you were made for. Look, I just got a puppy, and man, he is super cute. I got to tell you. And I live up in the mountains, and we have like mountain lions just cruising around all the time. And I have little tiny, I got some big kids. You've seen them, he's huge. But I got some little ones that are bite size. And so I got a breed of dog that's known to be a kind of guardian type of dog. And what's funny is he's 11 weeks old. He pees on the floor. He doesn't know his name, but you know what he knows how to do? When anybody walks down that driveway, he bristles. He fluffs up to twice his size, and he barks like a dog that is way bigger than he really is, because it's what he was made to do. In the same way, we were made to worship God. We were made to come into his presence. And the only way that you're going to have his presence is through Jesus Christ. He says, I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to me except through the Father. This is one of those exclusivity statements that really annoys a lot of people. Like, oh, you have the only way. Yeah, there is only one way, because faith in Jesus is utterly different than every other faith paradigm which has ever existed. Let me show you why. Last point, what does it mean? I have kind of three headings here for the note takers. There's grace, there's love, and there's hope. There's far more than that, but these are the three we're going to talk about. First, grace. The symptom, the byproduct of this of our sin against God, and this is a sin that everybody is culpable of. Adam and Eve were just they're just the ones that ended up in print. But if it were you or me, we still would have done it, because the sin was thinking, I know better than God how my life should go. And who hasn't said that, right? And so because of that, there are broken relationships in our lives. We have a broken relationship with God. We cannot come into his presence in the way that Adam and Eve could before the fall. There is something separating us. We needed a tabernacle to know him. But we also have broken relationships with nature, right? If you're over 29, you sense this, don't you? The second law of thermodynamics applied to the human body. This is why your knees hurt. Everything is breaking down. Everything is moving towards randomness. You have a broken relationship with nature. Not only that, you have a broken relationship with people, don't you? Look at and do a little self-examination here. Look at every relationship in your life that has been sullied, everything that has been broken. Pull the thread long enough, you are going to find pride, ego, selfishness, some form of sin that all began with that first sin. So the whole thesis of the Bible is that we have broken relationships with God, broken relationships with nature, and broken relationships with each other. And then through Jesus, God begins to heal all that brokenness. Because of his sacrifice on the cross, we no longer have a broken relationship with God, because the Bible says that we were all born with a debt. There's not one of us that could stand on our own merit and say, look, God, you owe me something because I've been so good. No, we are all born with a debt, and God he's perfect, he is holy, but that means he's a perfect judge. And so all of us stand condemned, but then Jesus paid the price. In a very monetary sense, he paid the price with his body and his blood. And if God is perfect, and he's a perfect judge, and he's perfectly just, would you agree? It would be unjust to demand penalty twice for the same sin. Jesus paid for our sin so that we could come before them. And look, Jesus is the tabernacle, and he works exactly the opposite way of the tabernacle. It almost works in reverse. I want you to see this. If you were to go to the tabernacle or the temple and you were to offer sin and sacrifice, or sacrifice for your sins like you did, there were all kinds of prescriptions. Little sins, you had to sacrifice bread and doves. Big sins, rams and goats and the rest. And then maybe if you had kept the observance, if you've kept the law, if you had offered the appropriate sacrifice, if you'd done everything right, God would bless you. That is the fundamental precept of every single religion which has ever existed. You do good, good will follow. If you don't do good, there are curses associated with that. You're going to reap the whirlwind. Only in Christianity is that completely flipped on its edge. Timothy Keller, preaching on this passage, said it better than I could. He said this: with Jesus, all your good deeds you do on the way out, not on the way in. All your good deeds you do on the way out and not on the way in. Whereas Old Testament Judaism and every other religion that's ever surfaced says, I'm going to do enough to get God to be pleased with me, and he's going to somehow bless me. Jesus lived the perfect life. And he died on the cross because he loved you, and he wanted to make a way for you to come home, for you to be in the presence of God, for you to do the very thing you were created for, which is to worship him with your life. And because you have seen something so beautiful in his sacrifice that it wasn't earned or deserved, it reorients the trajectory of your heart. And now you live differently because you've seen something absolutely stunningly beautiful, and it's changed you. All your good deeds are done on the way out. So we have grace. And look, it makes sense. If you're being good to people, if you're being kind, if you're being generous, if you're giving, if you're serving, whatever you're doing, if you're doing it to get God to bless you, that's not actually love. That's just a selfish agenda. You're doing it for you. You're not doing it for them. But now all of your good deeds, all of your generosity, it can actually come from a good place because nothing you can do can make him love you any more, and nothing you can do can make him love you any less. You're saved by grace. It's a gift. Next, love. We have broken relationships. It seems to, I'm a pastor. This is like half of what I do is I get to mediate broken relationships. 1 Peter 2, 4 and 5 says this: as you come to him, the living stone, rejected by humans, but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house, that is a temple, to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. This is the language of the tabernacle. And what does he say? You can't get on a plane or get in an Uber and drive to the tabernacle. You can't do it. But this says that you Christians, fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, what does it say? You are being built up like living stones and being built into a tabernacle. Your relationships, to the extent as a church community that we have these spiritually significant friendships and relationships. This is the unworking of the curse of Genesis that would see our relationships torn asunder. This is people, and by the way, this is one of the places where you get to observe it in the most shocking and interesting way. You can go to a lot of places in this country and churches are fairly homogenous. Everybody is something. Everybody looks like each other. Here you have people from literally every tribe and nation. We have people who like from every corner of the globe, a lot of different language traditions, who should not be friends on paper. But a church that is being built up like a spiritual temple. This is the unworking of the curse. All of a sudden, you have a group of people who really shouldn't be friends, loving each other for Jesus' sake. And to the extent that you do that and you manifest that, you are being built into a new temple. This is the fulfillment. This is the full realization of this is a picture of the garden. This is God's will, in heaven done on earth. This is why we put so much work and effort into our growth groups. We had a training last weekend. We trained 6 new growth group leaders. Every time we were able to launch a new growth group, this church grows. God blesses it, and it is because this is exactly what he's doing. You together. We are being built into a spiritual house, and it is in the context of those spiritually significant friendships. And look, read Exodus 35 through 40. The effort and expense they went into building this tabernacle, this tent of meeting, it's dwarfed by what eventually went into the later temples. But that same effort and expense has to be allocated to the relationships that we have with each other. It's not just enough to come to church on Sunday and pat yourself on the back for getting out of bed. That's not what we're doing. Our mission statement is we exist to bring a gospel movement to Silicon Valley that brings personal transformation, authentic community, and a mission of mercy to all people. It's the second one. You have to have spiritually significant relationships. And then hope. Again, the writer in Hebrews in 7:25, he says, therefore, he is able to save completely those who come to God through him because he always lives to intercede for them. I want you to see this. There's a couple of words here. Save completely. Not a little bit, not partially, not conditionally. And then he always lives to intercede for you. This is the hope we have. Because our relationship with nature has been broken. We all experience our bodies breaking down in death and decay. And I have to tell you, we said goodbye to Usha. And she was one of the very first people I met when I took on this role as pastor. It was my very first day, and her husband, Arun, pulled into the back parking lot because their only child had died. And they were looking for Nanda, my predecessor, and they got me. I still feel bad about that. And she was a beautiful person. She even in her final moments, she was just beautiful, even withered. This is the hope we have. This is the hope we have. And look, Saraya was born last week. Our lives are like a vapor. It's like a drop. In the context of eternity, it is a blip. If you're old enough, you're looking back on it, and it certainly seems like you blinked and it went right past you. The only hope we have, and the reason that what we're doing here in this church is so important, is that we live in one of the places where people are incredibly skeptical, sometimes outwardly opposed to the Christian message. But there is no other name under which heaven by which people are saved besides Jesus. And here we are. We're just not a tremendously large group, but we have the goods. You have the message. You have the one thing that they really need. This is the hope we have. This is the hope we have, that he saves completely those who come to God through him. This is the reversal of the second law of thermodynamics. That Jesus, look, God is perfectly just and he is perfectly loving. He had to see sin paid for. He had to see it paid for. But he is so loving that he paid the price himself. And this is the hope that we have. It is the hope that I have for Usha. It is the hope that I have for Saraya. It is the hope that I have for my own kid. It is the hope that I have for all of you. It happened. God really is a loving creator who created you in his image, and he really wants to be with you. That promise from Exodus that he wants to be with you and for you to be his people and for him to be your God, that is not lip service. He went the lengths to which he went to make a way for you to go home. He gave his son. No father ever loved his son this much, but he gave him for you because he loves you. He loves you. This concludes the teaching of God's word.